once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
And welcome in. Here we go. It is the ultimate episode of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trapper, ultimate in as much as the final one before we get back to things with any regularity. And we're not quite sure when that will be yet, but we'll figure that out. So lots to talk about, though, as we wind things down. The legislature wrapping things up for, I wouldn't even say the summer break. Holy cow. Anyway, we'll get into that. Around the table this morning on Thursday, June the 4th, Tim Hudak is here, former leader of the PC party. Now at Council Public Affairs, John Wright is our resident pollster. Kathleen Wynne is the former Premier of Ontario, and Keith Leslie, he is the veteran voice at Queen's Park. You hear and see him on CHTV, a variety of other podcasts, and of course has been a regular contributor here on the Ledge. Wow, almost 8 years. So this has been kind of cooking along. Yeah, it's not bad, right? So one of the things that I think we got to get this out of the. What's that?
Where's Keith's records?
Where are your records? All we can see is your laundry.
Yeah, I've still got the water in the basement issue being dealt with, so I'm up in my wife's sewing room, actually. So the records are safe. They were nowhere near the water, but I can't actually play them right now, so it is a bit of a pain.
Right, make sure you save the records, right?
Absolutely.
Let's get this out of the way because there was a good deal of conversation about it, and I realize that that the argument is going to be, well, MPPs are working even when the legislature is not sitting. I will default to the two former MPPs in the room. Tim, I get it, but boy, 21 weeks, is it? Something like that? It's like almost 5 months of away from the legislature. And forgive me for suggesting that, yes, I understand that I want my MPP, kind of cruising around my neighborhood just to get a feel for what's happening locally and what are the local issues and what are the concerns, whether, on a very grassroots, maybe in the weeds issue. But I fully expect my MPP to be present at Queen's Park debating legislation more often than that. I mean, 29 days in the last session. And we were joking just before we came on, we can all dress up as going door-to-door MPPs for Halloween, and we still might not see them in the legislature. They're off for that long. This just seems overly indulgent to be taking that much time off. Away from, again, I could qualify it, away from the legislature.
There was a line by political satirist P.J. O'Rourke who preferred the American state legislatures that met every 2 years because they could do a lot less damage unless they were in the state legislatures. So maybe that's the thinking. Yeah, look, there's a balance here to aspects of the job as an MPP, right? When you're in the riding, a lot of folks think the House isn't sitting, you're not doing anything. It's quite the opposite. That's where you, in my view, really earn a good portion of your paycheck for two reasons. You're there in the riding, helping constituents solve issues in your constituency office. You are running around the riding constantly, right? Because 7 days a week attending events, especially as things warm up, people get outside and event season happens, business openings, 60th anniversaries, all of that stuff, which is part of being seen, part of doing your job and understanding what's happening in the riding. And also it's a way to fine-tune your political barometer, understanding how people think about issues, how they talk about issues, and how those issues rank out. The other part of the balance, though, Dave, is being there in the legislature, holding the government to accountable, whatever side of the floor you're on. It could be legislation, but, it's most important part, I think, is the most effective tool for the opposition to hold the government to account, to shine the light of day in daily question period, to be there with the media, to make sure that the government is, acting responsibly. And the less you have of that, the more the system falls out of balance. And I don't know what the trend is over time, but it seems like it is decreasing. And at some point, you're on the opposition side of the House, and you're taking away tools that you two are going to need. Look, my last comment here, the Ford government has been very efficient. I've In the consulting world, they line up bills well ahead of time. They mark them out. They do more night sittings to get fewer things done faster. But I do worry that we're going to be increasingly out of balance. And any time that the opposition does not have a chance to do their job and shine a light on a day of government decisions and spending, the worse it is for democracy.
Kathleen, it was one of those things where this seems to have been sort of a slow trickle that the time away from the legislature gets increasingly longer, et cetera. And I think you and Tim have made the point in the past around, the new trend of the day kind of turns around and bites you in the butt when you lose, government and you're now in opposition, you're going to have that challenge. So this is one of those things, but I still think that there's a perception out there that, for a government, for example, that might criticize teachers for only, not working 2 months out of the year, all of a sudden, well, okay, hello.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I will say off the top that like most MPs and MPPs, it was very irritating when I would hear newscasters say they're off, they're on a break and they're on a break for X number of weeks because you do work. You're in your constituency office and that can be very rigorous. But I will also say that when I was premier, and coming into after that leadership in January of 2013, I made a commitment to come back according to the legislative calendar. As soon as the leadership was over, we came back after Family Day. I tried to stick to the legislative calendar because built into the legislative calendar um, are constituency weeks. There's time built in to get back to the ridings. As a Toronto member, it was much easier, but for members who are outside of Toronto, I understood that it was a challenge, and so obviously those weeks are important. I think there are a couple of things about this. I think that this premier is not particularly comfortable in question period. I think he doesn't. I don't think he likes it. I don't think he likes the scrutiny. I don't think he. I mean, he may like the cut and thrust, but his staff sure don't like it when he gets into it. That is a problem for this government. Um, I also think it's a very reactive government, and so Tim, you made a little bit of a slip there. You said they were getting fewer things done faster. I think you meant getting more things done faster. I would argue that it is getting fewer things done faster. I think that they actually don't have much of a proactive agenda. I think that they react to things. And apart from building infrastructure, there isn't really a vision of what they want the province to look like. Certainly not in healthcare, certainly not in education, certainly not in social services. Those things, they react to issues. And right now they're going into teachers' negotiations, for example. So that's not going to be a comfortable place for them. So I understand why they want to be away from the house. So I think that it's a problem. I think that they could have stayed and then come back saying that they're worried about the municipal election getting in the way. I mean, they have not been shy about interfering in municipal politics from the time they were elected. So I think that's just an excuse. And so I think it is a real challenge for MPPs. And I'll end on this. For MPPs, they get disconnected from the center. I mean, it's harder to hold the team together. And already there are challenges for this premier. We're going to talk about some of those later in terms of caucus cohesion. So I think it's a problem both for them and for the public.
Yeah, John, when we look at this, and it's all around public perception as much that just gets ingrained. And I echo what Kathleen said. I mean, recalling back to the 2018, after you and I put our pencils down following the election, we thought, okay, new government, they're going to take time. They'll get their cabinet in place, sworn in, blah, 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 blah. We'll be back at it just after Labor Day. Of course, then the province steps up and decides they're going to cut Toronto City Council in half. We put out the clarion call, and Keith answered, and we were doing the podcast all summer. So it's kind of ironic to suggest for a second that they were doing this to avoid any kind of suggestion of interference in municipal politics. But there is a public perception that they're not doing their job. And I don't care how often, and we can all agree that MPPs are working in their constituencies. The perception is they're not doing their job if they're not at their desk at Queen's Park.
I suppose so. I think number one is that we look at the two main governments that affect us, the federal government and the provincial government. Forget about the municipal side of the ledger for a moment. And, Mark Carney's at 50% in terms of vote right now as he moves ahead and makes a lot of decisions, which are clearly not engaging a lot of people. We see in the province now the repair of the public opinion polls where the premier's back to where he was at around 41%. So, maybe some people took the advice that we all had on this, that the premier should take a break out of the limelight and just extended it to the whole assembly. Look, I think there's another thing that I was thinking about last night before coming on here, and that is that we live in a very interesting age, which I would say is the appearance of publicly associated autocracy. We have a series of governments for a number of reasons, whether it be post-pandemic or whether it be because of Donald Trump and the impact on our society, where governments have given themselves almost without any problem whatsoever incredible powers. Bill C-5 federally, Bill 5 provincially, the FOIs both federally and provincially, strong mayors, powers that have been given over. Like there's been a centralization of power, and we see almost parallel issues between the MPs who are making waves nationally, within Mark Carney's caucus saying you're not consulting with us. And it is much broader than it appears to be, especially even among stakeholders where decisions are made and just you move forward. And we see that as well in the Premier's caucus. It just strikes me that we've got a situation where legislation and regulation controlled and centralized is allowing governments to basically move away from the accountability of the legislature. The Prime Minister has been in the House, 24 times? The Premier has been in the House, but the government now is deciding that it's going to take the many months off. So it's an interesting circumstance here where you could say, well, they just don't want to meet in the legislature. Well, that may be fair, but it's also a case you don't have to in many ways. It may not be until, the new Liberal leader gets in the House, whether or not the teachers' negotiations forces them into the House or something. But actually, over the last 5 months or so, governments across this country have absorbed significant powers that they've never had before to make autonomous decisions and to avoid scrutiny. And that usually has come at a time when there's weak opposition. There isn't anybody there to hold them together. So to me, I'm actually even thinking further ahead. Like, what does this mean for the opposition parties to the next election campaign? How are they going to run on opening government or doing more stakeholder engagement? Because it seems to me that in the short term, whether it's a Billy Bishop Airport or whether it's a 417 or whether it's, almost anything in this province, it may be a view that there should be accountability in the legislature, but they don't have to be there. They now have the regulatory control to do a lot of these things. So I reflect that we're in a very interesting time where the public has acquiesced to the external environment politically and allowed governments to absorb all of its powers. Basically, we're just going to make deals. We're just going to do our thing. We're going to, as the Conservatives would say, we're going to get things done. And that seems to me where that's led us to almost today.
Well, and that's at the heart of getting things done has been sort of the good, bad, and otherwise for the Ford government, Keith, in as much as it's double-sided. Sure, you can point to it and say we've accomplished these things, but in the effort to do many of those things, there have been, stumbles, if not on the verge of scandal, involved in some of the files. And that has happened, brought to the attention because the opposition's been in the House and the press gallery has been very active on that. Can I just suggest that perhaps the press gallery or reporters in general should stop saying, it's going to make my job harder? I get it, but at the same time, sweet, merciful baby Jesus, we've got to be in a place where, let's make sure that we're holding the government to account and be in your lane to do that. But I get the spirit of it. It's not. You're not going to. Well, but you're not going to get the premier on a hallway scrum. I get that.
Generally not, but you know when he's arriving in the car, you can stake out where the cars arrive. Premiers have been staked out on the way in before. I mean, I was always fair to governments when they took the legislative breaks. I said, you know, they're back to their constituency office. We'd point that out. It's not just they're off. But I do think in this case, it's fair to point out that this government is taking 5 months to avoid accountability. What, normally you would rise early to mid-June and be back early to mid-September. That's 3 months off. That's generally enough for a government to get itself together, do a cabinet shuffle if they have to, get the new ministers up to speed. But we're coming back a few days before Halloween. I mean, that's just a government that's trying to avoid accountability. And to hear Premier Ford, he just dismissed being held to account in the legislature as, we're better off. We can get a lot of stuff done outside the House instead of just being here arguing with each other. Well, it's not arguing with each other. It's public debate about public policies. And this is what's needed to shape the policies to make them better. He's just avoiding that completely and ramming stuff through on himself, on their own. And he even confirmed that when he said, we can do lots of things by orders in council. Yeah. Yes, you can. You sure can. That's another one that John just referring to their power. They can do a whole lot of things by orders in council, which just means government takes action, enacts things, and the opposition parties are left on the sidelines trying to get someone to say, hey, that's not, they can get no attention. The government is just doing this, and they can use their right to do this. This is absolutely avoiding accountability. It is anti-democratic. If you do, say 3 months off in the summer, it should be good enough for any government to get its act together again for the fall sitting. This is, and the whole argument about interfering with the municipal elections is laughable. It truly is laughable. And we're talking about a government as well that, we had an election campaign a year ago. There was a federal campaign. Did either one of those governments ever mention anything about, privatizing the airport or revamping Billy Bishop Airport? No. These governments are just doing things that are not accountable and not bringing this stuff in the legislature. And what are we seeing on the Billy Bishop example when we're trying to get the federal liberals to comment on it? Well, we don't see an official plan yet. We don't know what's going on because there is no official plan. The government's just writing this out. Premier Ford says, I want this. There's nothing really to debate, so they don't debate it. This is really, really a terrible way to shape public policy, but it is to the benefit of the government of the day for sure.
Tim, on the airport file, a couple of stories this week. The Star going kind of deep on who actually is pulling the strings in terms of the company that runs the airport specifically, and noting that really it's being controlled by J.P. Morgan, big U.S. investment firm, et cetera. And none of this was disclosed when we were having the conversations, who was going to benefit from it, all of those sorts of things. And then the Trillium, or it might have been Toronto Today, one of the Village media outlets, saying, we wanted to see some of the details on Billy Bishop, but they got quashed because of FOI. So all of a sudden, that's what's left in the wake here. Does the J.P. Morgan thing kind of stink or stick?
I'll say neither. But if I were opposition leader, I would certainly try to make either or both happen. I don't know. I just take this at face value, something I thought about during my time in politics and since. I remember being there when I think when Porter launched. We're being there as tourism, culture, and recreation minister, celebrating more flights coming into that airport. I believe that Billy Bishop has evolved to a place where it's part of the provincial infrastructure. It's no longer a municipal airport. I think people want to see greater access to choices there because of frustration they have at Pearson. I believe a lot of major cities, have two choices between a downtown and an outskirt, airport or more. So I just see this as part of a overall infrastructure plan of the Ford government to invest in transportation capacity, to create more convenience for travelers and create more business investment and activity. I don't see a boogeyman here, but your job as opposition, shine a light on it.
Can I just jump in, Dave? I mean, if indeed people, Tim, you're saying people want to see this expansion. I think the J.P. Morgan story is significant in that it's quite clear. I mean, we kind of knew this intuitively. And the poll that said 70% of Ontarians want this to happen. I mean, that is, most of those people are not affected by the airport at all in any way. And, I think the question couched the whole thing in terms of safety and the expansion of the runway. Well, yeah, okay. There has to be an expansion of the runway in order for there to meet safety standards. That's different than bringing in jets and expanding it to the lengths that they are going. But I think the JP Morgan story is important because it really shines a light on how the people who are interested in this have absolutely no connection or interest in what the people of Toronto, where the airport is located, are interested in or in their needs. And there was no discussion, to Dave's point, there was no discussion in any of the platforms of any of the parties that went into the last elections. And there has been no consultation, no discussion with the people of Toronto. So I just think that it's one more piece of evidence that this is a project that really has not been demonstrated to be in the best interests of the people who are going to be the very most affected by it.
John, the whole question around the J.P. Morgan connection to Newport Aviation is that for a long time, the ownership of that particular corporate entity was a little vague, and it took some digging by the Toronto Star to figure out who was doing what and who was pulling strings. I find it hard to believe that the folks at Queen's Park would not have known that the folks at City Hall would not have known that. So should not, like, some of that transparency is shared by all three levels of government in terms of, what the hell's going on at the airport. This is not just a provincial thing. It suggests to me a lack of complete transparency in terms of who was benefiting from any conversation around expanding the airport.
Well, I don't know how to answer that. And the reason is there's lots of entities that are owned and operated by others or invested in that we don't know of, and that governments clearly know who's pulling certain strings, or maybe it's a passive investment. The real issue is whether or not there's an organized opposition that forces these out into the open. I mean, if it hadn't been for the digging of a Toronto Star journalist, we wouldn't, in the business section, we wouldn't know, right? Like, it's just kind of, and then from a public perspective, does it matter? At the moment, it doesn't. It's completely benign. It's kind of like, okay, there's an investment. I mean, the only argument you could have there is, well, you've got private sector versus public sector, and public sector is good versus private sector is bad. And I go back to this, without an effective opposition to whatever government is in power, where there's a vacuum, there's going to be a breakaway. Like I said last time, I mean, governments have got a breakaway on the St. Lawrence River. It just kind of goes. And the problem that we have right now is that, Olivia Chow has got an election coming up, and there's no opposition to this, although she can, as I said last time, make it her own ballot question referendum for downtown. There isn't anything there that is being, I mean, you could say basically assets are controlled by American big interests and, investment companies, and we don't have an in there. Like, there's framing that could take place there. But Dave, I don't know how, in the absence of a good, solid opposition, and it's not Merritt Stiles, in the NDP, God bless her for what she does, but it's not her, because it doesn't have the same oomph. But if you have a federal government and MPs who, in fact, are not going to comment on this for a bunch of reasons, and if you have a municipal government that's not going to raise its ire, and what they're basically saying is, we're not going to comment on it until we have more information, and if you don't have a solid opposition across the floor in the provincial government, I don't know how else you deal with this. It just is a fact. They own it. There's, even Richard Florida has come out and said, we may quibble. I can't remember the exact phrase he used, but it was kind of like, we may not agree with the way in which the premier's done it, but it is the way it is. And this is how, like Tim said, there's lots of other places around North America where there are two airports. I come back to this whole sense that there's almost a publicly associated autocracy feeling that's going on here, but that's in the absence of opposition. So, I mean, people get the democracy they elect right now. There's a whole group that are completely silent on this, including the stakeholders.
Well, Keith, the thing that I think will stick in people's craw here is the notion that somebody at J.P. Morgan can decide who the CEO is at Newport Aviation. This isn't just about whether or not they're going to make money on it. They have pretty much complete control over how that airport is run on an operational level day to day. And I understand John's point around, there's no opposition banging the drum on it effectively, but I think it's a master in diversion and communications, actually, to be able to say, everybody wants an airport. Well, okay, I think he's probably right. We want the airport down there, but it's really easy to mix muddy the waters effectively here by saying that kind of stuff and divert from it. And I just as we go along, there seems to be more, what are you hiding? The whole lobbying process here seems to be way out of line. I mean, they were supposed to be making declarations in terms of who they were answering to, et cetera, both federally and provincially, and they didn't do it.
They not only didn't do the proper lobbying registration to make it clear that it was J.P. Morgan, that they were representing this Newman company, but I mean, it's the lobbying by them and that brought this to the forefront again. I mean, the island airport expansion has been debated over the years, but it was definitely in a low period. It wasn't mentioned in the federal and provincial elections last year. And all of a sudden, Doug Ford is a champion of this idea because lobbyists, he's been lobbied so hard and so heavy on this. What else, other conclusion can we come to? He didn't mention it in the election. It wasn't a priority then. It's nowhere been debated in the legislature. It's a Doug Ford idea by a government that was lobbied. So were the opposition parties. The federal government was lobbied. The city hall was lobbied. Apparently, they even hired a new Democrat lobbyist. These guys, A, they've got the coin, and B, they know how to set an agenda in a city. There's nothing wrong with a business trying to expand its business, whether they're privately owned, publicly owned, American. That's not the issue. The issue is how did they get this on the agenda simply by buying the right lobbyists and getting them to go to work on it. There's nothing illegal about any of that. That's all proper and above board, but this is how public policy gets made. They find a politician who's going to champion their ideas. The lobbying works really effectively, but they should have at least been straight on the lobbyist registry that it was J.P. Morgan that was at the top of this food chain and J.P. Morgan that directs who's going to run Billy Bishop Airport.
Kathleen, I don't know if that's, just too far down in the weeds on it, but, it kind of lends itself back to the Greenbelt discussion.
Yeah, I think that's right, Dave. I mean, I think that people, when they don't have any input, when the process is murky, and there hasn't been any discussion about, or in fact, I mean, in the case of the Greenbelt, there was the exact opposite statement that there wasn't going to be incursion into the Greenbelt, that the premier was going to keep his hands off the Greenbelt. But in this case, it literally came out of the blue, and I think that it is consistent with the kind of what is this government trying to hide? Why was there no conversation? I mean, it is a bit beyond me why the MPs are not speaking up. The Liberal MPs in the city of Toronto, I don't get that. I don't understand why they have not made it clear to the Prime Minister, and maybe they are in that process, but I think that it would make a lot of sense for those Liberal MPs to make it clear that this is not something that is going to help them at all. I mean, it's starting to come out a little bit now. That their constituents are not going to be happy with this if the waterfront, that's the other thing. There is a lot going on down at the waterfront. I mean, if you talk about Ontario Place and the Science Center and all of the building, there's going to be a lot of change down there, and then you add onto it a huge runway that's going to go across the waterfront in a way that it hasn't in the past. I think that people are rightly anxious about all of that. So yeah, I think that this feeds into this government's brand, which has become, we're not going to talk about this publicly. We're just going to try to do it. And I think they've gotten away with it. And John, I know you will tell me that Doug Ford's numbers are very high. I get that. That doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean what they're doing is right. It doesn't mean that they aren't engaged in trying to avoid scrutiny, because I think that's exactly what they are trying to do. They're trying to avoid scrutiny. And maybe, John, that actually works politically. I don't think it's good for democracy, and I don't think it leads to good public policy. That's my concern.
Tim, you might say that the federal Liberals are trying to avoid scrutiny too. I mean, just by laying low and let this thing play out. I mean, we don't want to get involved in the cat fight here.
No, they probably support growing the airport. Right? Like, I mean, Carney casts himself as a builder. He wants to see our economy revive. He's certainly been successful in a lot of major cities that have more than one airport. Like I'm smiling a bit here because I have my own internal Batman rule, and I think we crossed the Batman line. So, remember one time I was on Pakin's show, and Premier Wynne was on. We used to do this regularly. She used to hop in my car. We drive around. This is when we were sort of climbing the ladder in our own parties. So he might have been on that day, and I was going on a particular rant about Mayor David Miller and some conspiracy theory, right? And somebody texted in, "That's right," and the mayor hopped in the car with the Joker and Penguin and got away, right? We often will see those that are on the other side, and we'll build in sort of nefarious thinking. And I just don't think that this passes that test, and it is violating my Batman role. Like, my recollection was that Mayor Rob Ford was a big supporter of expanding Billy Bishop Airport. Doug was always at his side, whether as councillor or campaign manager. This seems very consistent with his worldview. He also, we are where we come from. He has focused on Toronto a lot as premier, maybe got involved more than others would have if they weren't from Toronto. He's a major builder of infrastructure, whether you like what Doug Ford has done or not. Boy, he talks a lot about expanding infrastructure, particularly transportation. Say what you will about the tunnel, right? But there's another example of, big projects that work. You should be clear of the lobbying rules. You got to follow those things, right? We need to make lobbying is an important role, right? You can be a voice for those that don't have a voice. You can make your case. You get information to government and opposition decision makers. They may not get otherwise, but you got to play by the rules. Agree with that. I just don't see the Batman conspiracy here.
I'm still with you, Tim, in terms of the conversation that's coming out of the
That wasn't
Toronto
enough
Star.
for Batman,
And,
yeah.
No, I like that, yeah. That Carney's a yeller, and I just wonder whether or not that's sort of a symptom of what we're seeing with the Toronto MPs saying, okay, we've had our say, whether they've been shouted down or not. I think you're right. The Prime Minister has already waved the flag for the Doug Ford plan at Billy Bishop. So, whether or not that's good leadership in the caucus room or not, I know you guys have got a thought on that, but there's a little bit more going on behind closed doors as far as the caucus is concerned than just, the outward smiles and handshakes.
Yeah, a lot here, so I'll try to be relatively brief. And sneak preview, we're taping this Thursday morning, so I'm looking forward to Premier Wynne's comments on the Deb Hutton show on News Talk later today on this very topic about caucus dynamics and the role leaders play in it. Look, you can hear from one caucus member, and Keith will have certainly done this in his time as a journalist. Another caucus member, you hear from the Premier's representative, you triangulate where the truth is. It's always somewhere in between. On this Carney stuff, I put it in the league that there is a new seriousness in Ottawa that was lacking, especially the tail end of the Trudeau administration. Carney's more focused on what he wants to do with our economy, the U.S. international relationships, on trade, getting big projects built. So my guess is he wants to focus on that agenda. And if caucus members bring up sort of whiny things or off agenda, he maybe have less patience for it than the previous leader. But I suspect it's all within bounds. Certainly talking to folks in the consulting business, liberal friends, you got to come prepared when you meet with the Prime Minister. He doesn't tolerate fools. You don't know your briefing note. You're quickly shown the door and you probably don't get invited back. But I respect that, in the situation that we're in here today. There's a special dynamic, and I'm so fortunate for 21 years being part of the PC caucus and how, issues are raised, how caucus members can work together, the way they'll send signals more than a direct confrontation when they want change. They'll blame staff or communications or such to drive a larger point. And there are ways of doing so that are within the game, and things will change. I do suspect the Premier heard a lot about the jet airplane in the province of Ontario. But sometimes you go outside, you color outside the lines, and you get snapped back, whether that's by the leader or a champion or defender within caucus. So I suspect on this one, I'm going to call it in favor of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, Kathleen, I know, and you were saying this before we came on, the idea that he has not sort of grown in the culture of the caucus and the party, et cetera, and the dynamics there. And I can see, given what Tim has said, that can cut both ways in terms of benefit and damage. But what's the outcome and what's the result? So I don't know if we end up cutting him some slack on that or how it works, but just your general thought.
Well, a couple of things. I think my overarching concern is that it's being talked about publicly, that whatever is going on, that somehow there are caucus members who feel that they need to talk about it publicly, that if I were the leader, I would not be happy about that. And I would ask the question, so what's going wrong in terms of the caucus dynamic? And I think that is, as a liberal who is very supportive of what the government's doing, supportive of the Prime Minister and of his caucus, it worries me that there might be that kind of tension. The second thing I will say is that yelling is in the ear of the beholder. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it means. If Mark Carney thinks that he's the CEO of the caucus and is behaving in that way and really doesn't have a grasp on the fact that he is, first among equals in terms of all of those people having been elected the way he was elected in his riding, then that's a problem. I think that's something that in our system you really have to remember, because those people, I always remember Jeff Leal coming back from Peterborough and talking about, the guys at the Tim Hortons, and giving us an update when we were bringing in the minimum wage. It was a real problem. The guys at the Tim Hortons thought that we were raising the minimum wage, that was a problem. So I think that, I don't hear it as whining when, Tim, you talk about MPPs or MPs whining. People bring their concerns from their constituencies, and the part of the job of the leader is to listen to those concerns. If that's not happening, that's a problem. If the Prime Minister's style is more bombastic or less patient than the previous Prime Minister, but you know what? There was lots of chatter about Prime Minister Trudeau's interactions or lack of interactions with caucus as well. There's an element of whatever you do, there's going to be criticism here. But I go back to my first concern. I don't know why it's being talked about publicly. Like, what's going on in that caucus that this needs to be leaked out? I think that's actually the biggest problem for the leader to deal with.
Well, and to your point on yelling, I just think I'm making my point forcefully. When I make my point, I get accused of yelling. And Keith, there was a lot. I willingly admit there are days when I would not have wanted to work for me. So I'm just saying that those things can happen. But at the same time, you need to be able to. And you used the phrase earlier, as far as the Ford government's concerned, get stuff done. At some point, you got to take control and move it forward.
I will admit that my wife on occasion has told me, don't project at me.
Yeah.
I think we have to remember that Mark Carney has only been a politician for just a little over a year. And we gave him high marks as the CEO class coming in as a politician. His performance in the House was pretty good. His performance in the election was way better than a lot of people expected it would be for someone who hadn't been, a line politician, who hadn't come up through those ranks. So perhaps his weakness is his caucus control because it's a private thing. And maybe this is where he's got to get his feet under him a little bit better. As you say, to hear a couple dozen of them coming out complaining at this point seems a bit rich when, he give him time to get his feet underneath him. As I say, get him to establish himself. And that seems, I guess if he yelled it upset a few sensibilities, but for goodness sakes, things are supposed to get heated in a caucus meeting. Things are supposed to, people are supposed to be able to get upset and pissed off if they have to and argue their points and then come out in the end with an agreed upon resolution. Sometimes you have to put a lot of water into your wine, as they used to say, or sometimes you can actually reach equal things. But caucus needs to be able to freely speak its mind to some degree. And the prime minister or the leader provincially, they have to be able to handle that input and make everyone sort of come together on the page at the end of the day. And so to hear this public dissension this early in his administration, it's a bit rich, really.
John, does this make
I have to tell a quick
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
have to just tell a quick anecdote about my kids, because you all know I raise my voice, I get carried away. I was not I tried really hard not to be a bully in terms of caucus and so on. But my kids, I realized what my kids were dealing with when one day one of them said to me, like, there are kids in my class who get really upset when the teacher yells. Like, what's the big deal? That's what they live with. It's like, why are they upset? This is what
Suit of
happened.
armor. So, John, does this suggest that a problem at in terms of a grassroots caucus level, or is this sort of just we're getting a glimpse of the humanity that is Mark Carney?
Well, I think every leader of every party brings to the table their personality shaped by where they've been and their occupations and everything else. This is a CEO. I mean, you could see him sitting at the cabinet table with the steepled hands saying, we're moving ahead. Thank you very much. Like, I don't need to go to Parliament that often. I'll go when I have to, but we're in a crisis situation. I'm here to make deals. I mean, he basically said to David Eby, Mark Carney did, you don't like this deal, I'll take it elsewhere. I mean, a few days later, they announced the LNG deal out there, but it's kind of like, look, we're here to make deals. And we've heard oftentimes about how the PMO centralizes how decisions are made. This one is tighter than any that I've seen in the past decades that I've followed politics. It's right into the minister's office is so deep that there are announcements made and staff have no idea until after the fact. So this is it's a matter of style. This is like, I do deals. That's what Tim Hudson does. He goes out, he gets the deals done. And if you don't like it, we're going to play the deal because that's what we've been elected to do. And look, our number's at 50%, so shut up. Brian Mulroney was very different. Jean Chrétien was very different. Working with Indigenous leaders, working with caucus, all that sort of stuff. Keep them happy, keep them on the side. It's where they've come from. I think a lot of the time this really, has to do with the individual personality. Again, I was giving thought to this as we close off this chapter of the legislature, and I want to say this in the least pejorative fashion. You look over the years, and every premier has their own persona, and I know we have former premier here, which was it was about education, it was about care, it was about looking after people, and especially those who were marginalized. We've had others who have been builders and things like this. Doug Ford strikes me as the mayor of Ontario. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, if that's what it is, it could be made to be a virtue. It's like, all right, well, I come from where the people live. I hear from the people on my cell phone. I listen to them. I go about making decisions that are very local. So I'm not really interested in the big legacy projects. And especially in Toronto, where I've come from, I understand that. I understand how school boards work, and I don't like the way things are done. So or even safe site injections. I don't like it because of the way in which the needles are left on people's lawns, and that should be dealt with. It's not a big esoteric thing to try and figure this out. So, as I said, it's not pejorative. It can be turned into a thing of, the province has a mayor, meaning that he's involved in communities and making decisions around that. And if that means that the caucus comes and they're going to have some discussions and dissensions around certain things, fine, but it may not be the priority that the premier's giving it. And it's like, okay, depending upon, as former Premier Wynne said, the confrontation of that, I can get somebody else to fill that role and that'll go away. Having said all of that, though, the question is really, do you want to silence those people? It's one thing to do it. It's another thing I've found that the best leaders I've ever dealt with, especially in public policy, are those who surround themselves with contrarians, who actually see the other side and who are able to advance those arguments a little bit like West Wing. Remember those where Jed Bartlett would be in there and they'd all be yelling and everything, and it would educate him, and then he'd say, I made this decision. Well, you kind of hope that goes on, and I've seen it happen in a few cases, but in this case, again, shaped by the individual leader in the office. You would think after 3 terms, with the political capital that this premier has, that the big legacy issues would be confronting some of the bigger issues that we have, such as the steep demographic issues that we have going on in this province. And it's really focused on 2 things. Number 1, local lives, local does. And the second thing is no taxes, which puts a squeeze on the revenue bottom line for almost everything that we need done, including hospital capitalization and education and capitalization, all that sort of stuff. But that seems to be how the government is framed. And if you are against that, well, then there's another chair for somebody else, I guess.
Well, and we can just flip into the caucus drama at Queen's Park then, Tim, and where the premier fires his caucus chair because the chair was speaking out on behalf of other Tory MPs who were concerned about the way the new pension plan was going to be framed. And I know that sounds way down in the weeds, but the seems as though the backdrop of that conversation was, holy crap, you're going to spend $28 million on a plane and we got to fund our own pension. It all sounds kind of contrary. The premier seemed to have a very short fuse on that in terms of making a decision as to who was going to be the caucus chair.
I don't know. Right? That's my triangulation, right? There's the stories from some caucus, other caucus, the premier spokesperson, and it's probably the truth is none of the above. It's some combination of each. Just to finish on the Carney thought, yeah, I mean the Premier Wynne brings up a good point, right? You need to be able to stay in touch with your caucus. They need to feel they played, that they're part of the system. And that's listening to commentary, seeing trends. It's also reaching out. It's a birthday, their daughter was born, or they, moved an important initiative forward that was important to their constituents. You need to maintain that over time. So we'll see. But my gut on that one tells me this is all indirect. There's probably greater discomfort with Carney, moving more to the right from where Trudeau was, and a lack of comfort by some MPs. I just think people often criticize indirectly as opposed to directly at what the real issue is within caucus. Okay, back to the Ford stuff. I had I was caucus chair for a while when John Tory was PC leader, and certainly was thoughtful when I was leader on the caucus chair role. And I've not dug into this. It makes me kind of uncomfortable, so I've got no insider scoop on this to share on the ledge. But when you're caucus chair, your job is more to be the referee, make sure debates are heard, everybody has their say, that you finish on time, the key issues are on the agenda, and the right time is given. You make sure the debate can be passionate, but make sure, it is focused at the end of the day. And there will be times where you need to bring something to the leader, but you bring it to him or her, directly as caucus chair in a private meeting or with a senior staff member that's part of that. You don't do it in front of the gang. So I don't know exactly what transpired, but there's certain rules of the game when you're caucus chair to support debate, but not to stand out in it.
Yeah, well, I guess, but I don't know what the dynamics are in that, Kathleen, in as much as I suspect that the interesting part of this story, the reporting done by, it seems, the entire press gallery for the Toronto Star, is that in a closed-door meeting of Tory MPPs at which no aides were present, so it means that it was MPPs who were making the comments.
It was members only.
Yeah.
They went into members only.
So yeah. it was a member who was actually relaying what was going on behind closed doors. They felt, to your point, making it public, they felt concerned enough about it that they were quite happy to talk about what happened there. And again, it was about the pensions and about the not being communicated well enough to the MPs, the Tory MPPs. But at the same time, the hint that they were sort of throwing up the plane in his face. That to me sounds far more concerning from a caucus perspective than what's going on in Ottawa, but you'll know better.
I don't know if, Tim, are you having PTSD on the pension issue? Because you were in government when the pensions were canceled, and you've created a whole passel of trouble over all these years, I can tell you. So the frustration is that the MPPs realized they were going to have to put their private dollars down to buy back their pensions to keep them whole, and they thought there was going to be government money that was going to go into that. So, um, you know, I completely agree with Tim that the caucus chair, I mean, when I was premier, the caucus chair, and when I was a member, the caucus chair would have conversations with the premier about what he or she thought was going on in caucus, and that would be a private conversation. So it is a measure of, to my mind, it's a measure of the frustration that Will Obama must have been feeling that that he did it in a different way. So there must have been a lot of turmoil, if indeed it did happen the way it's being reported, Dave. There must have been a lot of pressure on him to make a statement, to I mean, not to go public necessarily, but to do it in front of his caucus colleagues. So, so this is, again, I think this is a measure of people's frustration. You're right with the jet, but there are other things that have been going on in the government that have been building up, and we've been talking about them on this pod. We've talked about the skills development fund. We've talked about the green belt repeatedly. We've talked about the jet. So those are the FOI requests. I mean, those decisions that have been driven out of the premier's office are, they build up in the feedback that MPPs get from their constituents, and that builds frustration. And then being told that you got to put a couple $100,000 down to buy your pension back is kind of the straw. I think it's kind of the straw on the camel's back, actually. So that, to me, is, if I'm looking at the situation, that's what I see. And I guess to our original conversation, the premier's probably very happy that everybody's going back to their constituencies right now, and he's not going to be in caucus meetings for a while, which doesn't make it all right. It doesn't make it go away. It just kind of quietens it down for a while.
Well, that might be quiet, Keith, but this is a summer of negotiations with the teachers start today or tomorrow. And Minister Calandra saying he's confident we'll have something by Labor Day. I'm not sure I'd put the money on the under on that, but I posted yesterday, and tell me I'm wrong. This is going to be the script. The union will say the government is chronically underfunding our education system. Public education is at risk. They're not taking care of our kids, period. Government will say we have spent record amounts of investment in education over the years. The unions are just holding our kids and parents hostages, and most of the general public are going to say, pox on both your houses, just get a deal done. We don't want any disruption in the class. Is that fairly close?
I think you just summed it up completely. That's how everybody
Right.
just get a deal, for goodness sakes. You've got lots of time to do it. The issues are there. Just before we move on from the caucus thing, though, I do want to. The Toronto Star, I'm sure, talked to more than one caucus member because they had 3 bylines on that story.
Yeah.
And the lead of the story is what got to me. A chill went across the room. So when Will Obama said to the premier, well, that's kind of talking about the pensions and there won't be government money. I don't want the government. Well, that's kind of off brand for you spending $29 million on a jet. Whether that was just naturally came to him or whether it was something that was on his mind so heavily, it's hard to know. But he did say it publicly in front of the caucus room, and that, I imagine, really did send a chill right throughout the room. I can see it, especially if there's no staff there, no one else. And so hopefully that message got through to Doug Ford. I mean, but he clearly took a bit of retaliation for it. He didn't like it getting it publicly, and maybe that was the wrong way to do it. On the education thing, I know that, you essentially say you've summed up what people want, but I did notice a glimmer of hope there, or at least what I took to be a glimmer of hope, when Paul Calandra said that he agrees that this system they have every year of sending out layoff notices to teachers and staff every fall or every towards the end of the school year in the spring, and then basically most of them end up getting jobs in September. But in between, there's a lot of angst and a lot of upset, people getting layoff notices. He wants to get a better system for that. And the teachers, I think, and the QP, the other support staff all want a better system for that. So I think that, showing that the government's willing to move on that, which has been an irritant for a long time, may get them some progress. At least it's a good start. The class size things is always going to be an issue, and the unions have made it very clear. They've put some very specific numbers down, what they want to see. Will the government agree to fund that? I mean, they have in the past, but then they've reneged on it, and they've ended up with much larger class sizes than were promised. So it'll be interesting to see. But it's going to be a tough negotiation, and they know it is a set of negotiations. They're quite far apart right now, and the argument that despite I think the $100 billion, is it now, is going into public education, some astronomical amount, that it still isn't enough to keep up with all that's needed. We're seeing that the special needs students in particular are not getting the supports they need. Canceling of the outdoors education project. This one really caught me on that one because those crazy Finns over in Finland, they discovered that they brought forest floor dirt in and put it on the playgrounds of preschool and kindergarten kids, and they all became healthier within a year just being exposed to that kind of dirt. We're canceling the outdoor programs. The Finns have gone the other way. Schools are busing kids. If they're not near an area where they can go walk in the woods, they're busing them there. They're making regular walks in the woods, just something that simple as part of their education and health programs. And here we are canceling outdoor education programs. So there has to be better priorities set, but this government is hell-bent on it's going to decide how this money is spent by taking over control of these school boards. So I think they're losing a lot of good programs here, but there is an awful lot of money being spent and a record amount of money being spent. The government is right on that. Maybe it has to be divided up better or allocated in better ways. But right now, there's a lot of money going, but there's a lot of services being cut or not being met, needs not being met that should be met.
John, you look like you want to say something.
Well, yeah, it just it just strikes me. I mean, it's a paradox for the education system. I go back to the demographics of our society, and even though immigration has been tapped out for the time being federally, it hasn't had that much of an impact in filling the backlog of less students. I mean, that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Like if you go back 10 years or even 5 years ago, the amount of students that we have at the elementary level going into school and then exiting the other end is incredibly diminished, especially in a place like Toronto, where your expectation is, well, it's growing all the time. It isn't. The core is being hollowed out. Older and older people live here, and there's not as many young people. So you have this paradox where if you have a formula that's built on granting money to boards based on how many pupils you have, and if you have a decline in the demographic, which is a natural thing. I mean, I keep saying this. Everybody should go to Stats Canada. Take a look. Old, young, projected out for the next 30 years. Fill your boots. It's a natural circumstance. The money provided on a per pupil basis is less. That's it. However, what you have then is the paradox of increasing costs. I mean, you're not closing schools that are half empty. You've got big buildings and salaries and everybody else that you've got to run. And you've got inflation that's going on top of that. Plus, you've got backlog of capital costs. So it's like, of course, I don't know how you solve it. That's not my job. But what you have is this diminishing return based on natural circumstances of children not being born in this country and not enough filling the backlog and still sitting with the same infrastructure and all the demands on top of that. So, I mean, governments can claim that they're spending more and more and more on everything, healthcare, education, all this sort of stuff. But you're not solving anything. Like we're not dealing with, in the same way the healthcare system is not readying for the demographic that is coming or just about there in every part that is going to have an immense impact. We're not actually addressing the real problem as we have shrinking people. And that is really, we're more than half a baby short right now, and that's showing up. Take a look out 10 years. Unless something is done to address that and the infrastructure around it and how much we're paying to keep schools open that are half empty and all those things, then we just go through this endless, wash, rinse cycle. And it's just happening more and more. So you're right. To frame the debate the way you're framing it, Dave, it's going to happen. But to address the issue on both sides, whether it be healthcare or education, it's more complicated, but that's what it is.
Tim, is this another jalopy in the garage that is beyond repair? I mean, look at the system. I mean, no, but look at
Batman. Come on.
But look at the system, right? I mean, and to John's point, we quickly talk about contracts with teachers as if we are rebuilding or revisioning the education system, and they're two different things. I understand how closely they are related, but it's getting to be a problem where we're having a harder time to get our arms around.
I appreciate the reference to my jalopy analogy for healthcare. The Batman I talked about, my insights may not be interesting or particularly useful, but they're memorable at the end of the day. Uh, I don't think it's quite ready for the shop yet, but I agree with part of that. I just see more people choosing independent schools. There has been a growth in independent schools and people opting out of the public system. There's no doubt there's been a shift out of the public system towards the Catholic system, particularly in in the high school level, which I think is some people may not be Catholic, but choosing what they'll perceive to be a greater values-based education. So there is dissatisfaction with that. All had been said, this is not a government that is looking for major structural change nor a fight. I don't think the unions will view they can push this too far because, Dave, you characterizing very well the lack of tolerance for parents for any kind of disruption. So I suspect we'll have a compromise. If I could put my wishful thinking on the table, I do hope that the government will be part of negotiations, but there are too many schools that are half filled, close to other schools that could be closed, and those funds could be put into classroom education, especially for kids with special needs. And I'd like to see some sort of compromise in teacher absences. I just note that with Maitland, we saw it before with Miller, that the growth in teacher absences, which has not been good for quality of education, maybe the union can bring something to the table and we can actually get to a greater point of stability with the classroom teacher.
Yeah, and Kathleen, this isn't necessarily a political stripe thing because, you guys had your own challenges in government with teacher negotiations, et cetera. And, so I think the teachers kind of march their own march and bang their own drum on this. But the public perception is do what you got to do, but just don't bugger up the kids' school year.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think to paint every government with exactly the same relationship to the education sector is just not fair. I don't think that's a fair description. If this government were really concerned about declining enrollment in certain pockets, and I will just note that there are 2 to 2.1 million kids in the education system today in the publicly funded education system. And you know how many there were when I was Minister of Education? 2 to 2.1 million. So the declining enrollment issue is that it's not evenly distributed. So there are places where there is severe declining enrollment and there are places where there is burgeoning. In the riding that I represented, there was not an empty school. There were kids across the socioeconomic levels that were in schools that were full. So it depends where you are in the province, the declining enrollment issue. And if this government were really concerned about schools being empty and, lack of consolidation of school buildings, then they wouldn't have tied the hands of boards in terms of closing schools. We put a moratorium on closing schools in order to change the system to change the way schools got closed and consolidated, and to put some more incentives in place to consolidate and share spaces, for example, between Catholic and public and French and English. None of that happened, and they just kept the moratorium on and didn't allow school boards to close schools or consolidate. Well, guess what they are letting the supervisors do? They're letting the supervisors close schools because that's the only way that you can deal with declining enrollment. There is so much wrong with the way this government has dealt with the education system, and it is not the same as the way our government dealt with the education system. We can go chapter and verse on every single policy, but there are major differences. And yeah, sure, there were conflicts with the school. The school community, the workers, the unions, the federations in some cases, but nothing like what we saw under the government before us. There was a completely different relationship. And that was one of the things that, was really critical to our government. So this government, maybe they have got some money in reserve, and, that's why Paul Calandra is feeling so confident. Maybe they parked money in their fat contingency to deal with the labor issues around education. Maybe that's why he's sounding confident about his ability to get a deal. But class size is about actually kids getting what they need in the classroom. It sounds like a kind of anodyne, bloodless thing, but it is about not having 30 kids in a kindergarten, in a full day kindergarten class, and allowing those little babies to actually get a good start. So I think it's going to be a difficult negotiation. I think, yes, of course, the a pox on both your houses, that comes after a certain amount of time when things drag on. I hope we don't have labor disruption. I've got 4 grandkids who are in the publicly funded system. I want it to go well. And Tim, to your point about the Catholics, people going to the Catholic system, the way I see it, when I was Minister of Education, the public system is the system of last resort. It's the system that has to take everybody. And so whether you go, if you're in the French system or you're in the Catholic system, there's an element of choice in that, which there isn't in terms of the publicly funded system. So it's where the bulk of the kids who have major concerns end up. It's the system that takes everybody. And in terms of people leaving to go to private school, yeah, that may be true in the large centers. There is no UCC in Wawa. So the fact is that kids go to the publicly funded schools. Still well over 90% of kids in the province, it was 95%, it's probably around that still, go to our publicly funded system because that's the school that's available to them. So we have to get this right. And I will just say this government has not made publicly funded education a priority right from kindergarten through to post-secondary. And we haven't even talked about post-secondary, which is in a huge mess. So I think it's going to be a difficult negotiation. And this government has a relationship with the education system that was colored by COVID, quite frankly. They went through negotiations during COVID, and everybody had to kind of pull up their or swallow their concerns and get a deal. I don't know if that's what we're going to see this time around.
Okay, well, let's leave it here, and if need be, we'll revisit this conversation as we watch the negotiations carry on. So for the short term, we're going to take our leave of all use, but thanks for being here and listening, watching, sharing the podcast. It's always great to have the feedback. And for those of you who listen on the radio, thanks for doing that too in Windsor and in Toronto. John Wright, Tim Hudak, Kathleen Wynne, Keith Leslie, enjoy your time off. We'll be back before Halloween, though, I guarantee it. I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast.
Pay no attention to